The morning sun cast long shadows across the limestone steps of the Temple of Isis at Philae, its rays illuminating hieroglyphs that had witnessed the rise and fall of pharaohs for over a millennium. In the year 535 CE, this sacred island in the Nile's waters represented something far more dangerous to the Byzantine Empire than mere stone and mortar. It harbored the final remnants of a civilization that Rome had spent centuries trying to erase. High Priestess Ankh-ef-en-Sekhmet moved through the temple's inner sanctum with practiced reverence, her linen robes whispering against the polished floors. At 63, she carried within her memory the oral traditions that stretched back through an unbroken chain of priestesses to the time of the pharaohs. Her weathered hands traced the sacred cartouches carved into the walls, each symbol a defiant testament to the old ways that Emperor Justinian's edicts sought to destroy. The temple's architecture itself told the story of cultural resistance. Built during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek rulers had embraced Egyptian traditions, every column and relief depicted the eternal struggle between order and chaos, Ma'at against Isfet. The sanctuary's design followed ancient principles. The hypostyle hall, with its towering columns, represented the primordial marsh from which all life emerged, while the inner sanctum housed the sacred bark of Isis, mother goddess and protector of the oppressed. Beyond the temple walls, the political landscape had shifted dramatically. Christianity, once a persecuted faith, now wielded imperial power with the same ruthlessness that had once been directed against it. Justinian's recent closure of the last philosophical schools in Athens sent a clear message. The old knowledge had no place in the new Christian world order. Yet here, on this remote island, between the first and second cataracts of the Nile, the ancient wisdom persisted. Ankh-ef-en-Sekhmet paused before a seemingly ordinary wall relief depicting Isis nursing the infant Horus. To casual observers, it appeared no different from countless similar images throughout Egypt. But her trained eyes recognized subtle variations in the hieroglyphic text, modifications that had been carefully introduced over generations to preserve knowledge that the Romans considered seditious. The secret lay not in magical formulas or supernatural prophecies, but in something far more threatening to imperial authority, a complete record of alternative governance systems that had flourished in Egypt before Roman conquest. Hidden within religious imagery were detailed accounts of councils where common farmers had voice alongside nobles, of legal systems that prioritized restoration over punishment, of economic models that prevented extreme wealth concentration. These weren't mere historical curiosities. They represented practical alternatives to the rigid hierarchies that supported Roman power. The priesthood had recognized that preserving this knowledge required more than simply copying texts. It demanded encoding it within religious practices that could survive political upheaval. Tribune Marcus Flavius arrived at Philae with orders that carried the weight of imperial authority. A career administrator in his 40s, he had overseen the conversion of temples across Egypt with methodical efficiency. His weathered face bore the permanent squint of a man who had spent decades in the desert sun, implementing policies designed in the comfortable chambers of Constantinople. Flavius understood the broader context of his mission. The Roman Empire was transforming itself into a Christian state, and this transformation required the systematic elimination of competing worldviews. Temples weren't being destroyed merely out of religious zeal. They were being neutralized because they represented alternative centers of authority and knowledge. The meeting between Ankh-ef-en-Sekhmet and Flavius took place in the temple's outer courtyard, where massive pylons depicted pharaohs making offerings to the gods. The irony wasn't lost on either participant. They stood beneath images of rulers who had successfully integrated diverse peoples and beliefs while discussing the elimination of that very diversity. "The emperor's decree is clear," Flavius stated. his Latin words echoing off the ancient stones. All pagan temples must close. The priests will receive compensation and relocation assistance. Ankh-ef-en-Sekhmet's response came in fluent Greek, the administrative language of the Eastern Empire. "We understand the law, Tribune, but surely you recognize the historical value of what we preserve here. Our records span 3 millennia. Flavius had encountered this argument before. Every temple claimed to house irreplaceable knowledge, yet he had learned to distinguish between genuine scholarship and desperate negotiation tactics. Something in the priestess's manner suggested she possessed information that went beyond typical religious texts. The negotiation that followed revealed the complex reality of imperial administration. Flavius operated within a system that demanded results while providing limited resources. Destroying the temple would be straightforward, but it would also eliminate any valuable intelligence about local governance that might prove useful for maintaining order in the region. The priestess, meanwhile, faced an impossible choice. Revealing the true nature of her knowledge might preserve it, but would also ensure its suppression. Concealing it might protect the information, but would likely result in its loss when the temple was inevitably closed. As the sun reached its zenith, casting shadows directly beneath the temple's towering columns, both participants recognized they were negotiating not just the fate of a building, but the survival of knowledge that challenged the fundamental assumptions of imperial power. The first chapter of this ancient struggle was ending, but the true test of wills was yet to begin. In the hidden chambers beneath the temple, scrolls and inscriptions waited to reveal secrets that Rome had spent centuries trying to erase. Knowledge that threatened not through supernatural power, but through the simple, revolutionary idea that governance could serve the governed rather than the governors. Don't forget to like this video if you're enjoying this journey into ancient Egypt's hidden history, and subscribe for more untold stories from the past. In the next chapter, we'll discover what treasures lie hidden beneath the temple floors. What do you think the priestess is really protecting? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Beneath the temple of Isis at Philae, a network of chambers extended deep into the bedrock of the sacred island. These weren't the product of modern archaeological imagination, but historical reality, underground spaces that had served multiple purposes throughout the temple's long history. Originally designed as storage areas for the massive quantities of grain, oil, and precious materials required for temple operations, they had evolved into something far more significant: the last repository of Egypt's suppressed governmental traditions. Tribune Flavius descended the narrow stone steps, his torch illuminating walls covered with what appeared to be standard religious imagery. Yet Priest Katie, who served as his reluctant guide, knew that every symbol carried multiple layers of meaning. The young priest, barely 30 years old, represented a generation caught between worlds, educated in the old traditions but forced to navigate the new political reality. The air grew cooler as they moved deeper underground, carrying the distinctive scent of papyrus and cedar oil that indicated the presence of preserved documents. The Romans had learned to recognize this smell during their systematic cataloging of Egypt's temples. It usually meant they had discovered another cache of religious texts that would need to be evaluated for seditious content. The first chamber they entered appeared to fulfill these expectations. Neat rows of papyrus scrolls lined wooden shelves, their contents labeled in hieratic script. Flavius had encountered similar collections throughout Egypt: hymns, ritual instructions, astronomical calculations, and medical texts that formed the standard curriculum of Egyptian priestly education. But Priest Katie directed their attention to a section that seemed different. The scrolls here were larger, written on higher quality papyrus, and secured with cedar strips that indicated documents of particular importance. More significantly, they were labeled in multiple scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, Greek, and even Latin, suggesting content meant to be accessible across cultural boundaries. These contain the administrative records of the temple estates, Katie explained, his voice carefully neutral. Accounts of how the priesthood managed the agricultural lands, trade relationships, and civil disputes in the region. Flavius examined several scrolls, his administrative training allowing him to quickly assess their contents. What he found surprised him. These weren't simple financial records, but sophisticated analyses of governance systems that had operated in Egypt before Roman conquest. They documented experimental approaches to taxation, legal procedures that emphasized restoration over punishment, and economic models that had successfully prevented the extreme wealth concentration that plagued the empire. One papyrus contained a detailed comparison of different methods for organizing agricultural labor. The Egyptian system described collective decision-making processes where farmers themselves determined planting schedules, irrigation priorities, and harvest distribution. The document included careful analysis of productivity rates, showing that these participatory methods often exceeded the output of traditional slave-based agriculture. Another scroll examined judicial procedures used in Egyptian nome capitals. Rather than the Roman emphasis on punishment and deterrence, these courts focused on repairing community relationships damaged by conflicts. The documents included case studies spanning several decades, with follow-up assessments that tracked the long-term effectiveness of different resolution approaches. Most intriguing to Flavius was a collection of scrolls that analyzed the economic policies of various Ptolemaic rulers. These documents revealed sophisticated understanding of market dynamics, inflation control, and public works funding that challenged common Roman assumptions about Egyptian administrative capabilities. The priesthood had apparently maintained detailed records of which policies succeeded and which failed, creating an empirical foundation for governance that surpassed most contemporary Roman analysis. The deeper chambers contained even more remarkable materials. Here, the walls themselves had been converted into a massive information storage system. Carefully carved reliefs depicted not mythological scenes, but detailed diagrams of governmental structures, legal procedures, and economic relationships that had operated throughout Egyptian history. Priest Katie guided Flavius to a wall that appeared to show a standard scene of Pharaoh receiving tribute from foreign lands. But closer examination revealed that the tribute bearers were actually representatives from different Egyptian regions, and the hieroglyphic text described not submission, but negotiation. The scene documented a system where local communities had retained significant autonomy while participating in larger governmental structures. The Old Kingdom operated differently than most people understand, Katie explained, his scholarly enthusiasm overcoming political caution. Power flowed upward from local communities rather than downward from central authority. The pharaoh's role was to coordinate and balance regional interests, not to impose imperial will. This revelation struck at the heart of Roman governmental philosophy. The empire's stability depended on rigid hierarchical control, with authority flowing from the emperor through appointed officials to subject populations. The Egyptian alternative suggested that effective governance could emerge from popular participation rather than imperial mandate. Flavius found himself torn between his official duties and genuine intellectual curiosity. The documents before him represented 1,000 years of experimentation with governmental forms that Rome had systematically eliminated. Yet they also contained practical insights that could address current imperial problems: economic inequality, administrative corruption, and regional instability that plagued even well-governed provinces. The most dangerous discovery came in the final chamber, where a complete archive documented the transition period when Egypt had been incorporated into the Roman Empire. These records revealed that the initial Roman administrators had actually adopted many Egyptian governmental practices, finding them more effective than imported Roman methods. However, as imperial policy shifted towards centralization and standardization, these hybrid systems had been deliberately dismantled. The scrolls contained correspondence between early Roman governors and their Egyptian advisors, discussing the challenges of governing a population accustomed to participatory decision-making. One governor's report to Augustus himself acknowledged that Egyptian administrative methods produced better results, but warned that allowing them to continue might encourage similar demands throughout the empire. This archive documented not just alternative governmental systems, but evidence that Rome had consciously chosen less effective methods in order to maintain imperial control. The priesthood had preserved proof that the empire's problems weren't inevitable results of governing large populations, but consequences of prioritizing centralized power over effective administration. As Flavius absorbed the implications of these discoveries, he realized he faced a decision that would affect far more than one temple's fate. The knowledge preserved here challenged the fundamental legitimacy of imperial governance, yet it also offered solutions to problems that threatened the empire's stability. The underground chambers held secrets that Rome had tried to erase, not because they were false, but because they were true. The question now was whether that truth would die with the temple or find new ways to survive the coming transformation. This hidden archive reveals why Rome was so determined to suppress Egyptian knowledge. Hit the like button if this historical revelation surprised you, and don't forget to subscribe for the final chapter where we'll discover the ultimate fate of this dangerous knowledge. What would you do in Tribune Flavius's position? Let us know in the comments. The final confrontation at the Temple of Isis took place not in the heat of passion, but in the cold calculation of political necessity. Tribune Marcus Flavius stood in the temple's main sanctuary, surrounded by evidence that would reshape his understanding of imperial governance. The question was no longer whether to close the temple. That decision had been made in Constantinople months earlier. The real choice concerned what would happen to the knowledge that challenged everything Rome represented. High Priestess Ankh-ef-en-Sekhmet had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing for this moment. At her age, she had witnessed the gradual erosion of Egyptian traditions under Roman rule, but she had never faced such a complete threat to their survival. The emperor's decree wasn't simply closing temples. It was attempting to erase alternative models of human organization that had evolved over millennia. The morning of the temple's final day brought an unexpected gathering. Word had spread through the Nubian communities south of the cataracts that Philae would close. Farmers, merchants, and tribal leaders who had maintained connections to the temple for generations arrived to witness the end of an era. Their presence transformed what should have been a simple administrative action into a moment of historical significance. These weren't the romanticized noble savages of later European imagination, but sophisticated peoples who had maintained complex trade relationships, diplomatic protocols, and cultural exchanges with Egypt for over 1,000 years. Many spoke multiple languages and understood the broader implications of Rome's cultural policies. They recognized that closing Philae meant severing connections that had sustained their communities through countless political changes. Tribune Flavius found himself facing not just a religious ceremony, but a diplomatic crisis. The Nubian leaders made clear that they viewed the temple's closure as a violation of treaties that had guaranteed their traditional trading rights. More troubling for imperial stability, they hinted at alliance discussions with Persian agents who were actively encouraging resistance to Byzantine authority. The political calculation became complex. Closing the temple according to schedule would fulfill imperial orders, but might destabilize the entire southern frontier. Delaying the closure would invite questions about Flavius's loyalty and effectiveness. Yet the knowledge preserved in the temple's archives offered potential solutions to administrative problems throughout the empire. Priest Katie emerged as an unexpected mediator in these final negotiations. His generation had grown up navigating between Egyptian traditions and Roman requirements, developing skills that neither older priests nor Roman administrators possessed. He proposed a solution that reflected this cultural dexterity: preserve the essential knowledge by integrating it into acceptable Roman frameworks. The plan that emerged over the next several days demonstrated the creative adaptation that had characterized Egyptian survival throughout centuries of foreign rule. Rather than destroying the archives or allowing them to be completely suppressed, key documents would be translated into Greek and Latin, reformatted as philosophical treatises, and attributed to acceptable classical authors. This wasn't simple deception, but sophisticated cultural translation. The Egyptian concepts of balanced governance would be presented as developments of Platonic political philosophy. The economic analyses would be reframed as commentary on Aristotelian ethics. The legal innovations would be described as applications of Roman jurisprudence to Egyptian conditions. The process required remarkable scholarly skill. Each document needed to be carefully analyzed to extract its essential insights, while removing cultural markers that would identify it as Egyptian. The most dangerous political concepts had to be disguised as abstract philosophical speculation rather than practical governmental alternatives. High Priestess Ankh-ef-en-Sekhmet recognized that this compromise meant the death of Egyptian tradition as a living culture, but it offered the possibility that Egyptian wisdom might survive in new forms. Future scholars might rediscover these ideas and apply them to their own governmental challenges, even without knowing their true origin. Tribune Flavius faced his own difficult calculations. Supporting this preservation effort exceeded his authority and violated the spirit of imperial orders. Yet his administrative experience had shown him the practical value of the Egyptian innovations. Allowing this knowledge to survive, even in disguised form, might serve imperial interests better than destroying it completely. The actual closure ceremony took place on a cool morning in November 535 CE. The last sacrifice to Isis was performed according to traditions that stretched back over a millennium. The sacred fire that had burned continuously for generations was finally extinguished. The great doors of the sanctuary were sealed with imperial wax and the emperor's personal seal. But in the weeks that followed, a steady stream of papyrus scrolls made their way from Philae to scriptoriums in Alexandria, Antioch, and even Constantinople. Scholars throughout the Eastern Empire began receiving Greek and Latin manuscripts that contained remarkably sophisticated analyses of governmental problems. Few recipients understood the true origin of these insights. The most successful preservation occurred through an unexpected channel. Christian monasteries, dedicated to copying and preserving texts, proved remarkably receptive to philosophical treatises that discussed justice, community organization, and ethical governance. Many Egyptian concepts found new life as expressions of Christian social teaching. The irony was profound. Rome had closed the Temple of Isis to eliminate alternatives to imperial authority. Yet the temple's knowledge survived by adapting to the very Christian framework that had replaced it. Egyptian insights about participatory governance became theological discussions about Christian community. Economic analyses became moral treatises about stewardship and justice. Some of the preserved knowledge would influence medieval Islamic scholarship, where Egyptian administrative practices were studied and refined. Other concepts would emerge during the European Renaissance as rediscovered classical wisdom. A few ideas would even contribute to Enlightenment thinking about democratic governance, though their Egyptian origins would remain hidden for over a millennium. Tribune Flavius completed his mission by submitting a detailed report to Constantinople that described the successful closure of Egypt's last pagan temple. He mentioned the discovery of administrative documents that might prove useful for governing the region, but he carefully avoided describing their theoretical implications for imperial governance. His career advanced steadily, and he eventually retired to a comfortable estate near Thessalonica. High Priestess Ankh-ef-en-Sekhmet lived for 3 more years after the temple's closure, spending her final time in a small house overlooking the Nile. She died knowing that Egyptian civilization as a political and cultural entity had ended, but believing that its essential wisdom might survive in new forms. Her funeral was attended by both former temple personnel and Roman officials who had come to respect her scholarship. The Temple of Isis at Philae would remain sealed for over 13 centuries. When European explorers finally reopened it during the early modern period, they found empty chambers and defaced reliefs. The underground archives were empty, their contents long since removed. Most observers concluded that the temple had been thoroughly destroyed by Christian zealots, never suspecting that its most valuable treasures had actually been preserved through careful adaptation. The true legacy of Philae lay not in the stones that tourists would eventually visit, but in ideas that had survived by transforming themselves. Egyptian concepts of balanced governance, restorative justice, and participatory economics had found new expressions that continued to influence human development long after their origins were forgotten. Rome had tried to erase the secret knowledge of the Temple of Isis, and in one sense, they had succeeded. Egyptian civilization as an independent cultural force had been eliminated, yet in another sense they had failed completely. The ideas that made Egyptian governance distinctive had proven more resilient than the empire that sought to destroy them. The choice made at Philae in 535 CE demonstrated that knowledge, like water, finds ways to flow around obstacles. Cultural suppression might eliminate visible symbols and institutions, but it cannot destroy insights that address fundamental human needs. The secrets hidden in the Temple of Isis had survived by becoming something new, carrying ancient wisdom into futures that their original creators could never have imagined. And so ends the remarkable story of how ancient Egyptian governmental wisdom survived Rome's attempt at cultural erasure. If this hidden chapter of history fascinated you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the ancient world. What other lost knowledge do you think might be hiding in plain sight throughout history? Share your theories in the comments below, and don't miss our next exploration into the secrets that shaped our world.